My name is Tim Lewis, and it's been my honor to work with and on behalf of the Summit for the past 3 years. And it is my honor this morning to moderate a panel of what people like Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and others have referred to as foot soldiers in the front lines of the battle for justice and fairness. Lawyers who have taken up the cause of fighting anti-Semitism and racism and discrimination in all of its forms as a part of their commitment to justice. And so we have with us this morning Jim Felte, who is the chief of the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. And in addition to investigating and prosecuting cases throughout the country for various forms of deprivations of liberties and rights under the Constitution, the criminal section of the Department of Justice has a long history of prosecuting acts of violence motivated by bias, including hate crimes. So the criminal section worked shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Pittsburgh and other partners in the prosecution of the perpetrator of the Tree of Life massacre, as well as many other cases in which race, religion, ethnicity, and other forms of personal identity were threatened or were violently attacked. Jim is a longtime Department of Justice attorney whose tenure has seen the proliferation of hate crimes, and he has been a key figure in defining and implementing the government's response. We also have with us this morning Dan Cramer. Dan is a highly acclaimed attorney at the Paul Weiss firm in New York, where he specializes in securities enforcement litigation. His client list reads like a who's who among the leading financial institutions and corporations. But as impressive as that is, it is his pro bono work that truly stands out. It is vast and it is impactful, and it includes his work with the Anti-Defamation League and the States United Democracy Center to recover damages against the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers in connection with the January 6th attacks. Also with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights to recover damages from the Proud Boys for damage to a revered black church in Washington, D.C. because of that church's support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in addition to all of that, Dan has a more personal reason for being here with us today, and he will share that with you too, I am sure. We also have Licha Nyiendo. Licha is the Chief Legal Officer of Human Rights First, and she is the first person to hold that position. Human Rights First, as its title suggests, is a human rights NGO dedicated to advocating for better policies to redress human rights violations and to pursue those interests in court on behalf of victims, and also pursuing important research to address and redress human rights abuses. It also administers the Fighting Discrimination Program, which cooperates with other NGOs throughout Europe and North America to fight hate crimes. Licha is an experienced trial and appellate lawyer who previously served as commissioner for the New York State Division of Human Rights. She also served as an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of New York, prosecuting sex trafficking, forced labor, and civil rights abuses. And she also happened to clerk for my dear friend and brother, Ted McKee, the former Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. And finally, Justin Herdman is with us today. Justin is a partner at Jones Day in its Cleveland office. And like Jim Felte, Justin has had a distinguished career in law enforcement, starting as an assistant district attorney in New York City. He served as an assistant United States attorney and later as the United States attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. In these capacities, he has investigated and prosecuted domestic terrorist cases, but his commitment and work in this realm has transcended his tenure as a chief law enforcement officer. After leaving the United States Attorney's Office and in the wake of the Buffalo Tops supermarket mass shooting, Justin appeared before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee to urge federal authorities to thwart domestic terror threats by working closely and collaborating with local law enforcement and the communities that are under threat. Would you please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel? Thank you. So, may we begin with Justin Herdman. Justin, you started your tenure as the United States Attorney the week after the events in Charlottesville happened. Can you share with our audience some of what you observed in the aftermath of that event?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Well, in the run-up to actually getting sworn in as U.S. Attorney, it was August 21st, 2017 is when I was sworn in. I was actually on vacation with my family. I had left the law firm knowing that I had been confirmed, and I was planning to start on August 21st. And while we were on vacation, all the images from Charlottesville and the event there were on the news. So I was watching this, and I was thinking to myself, okay, first day I'm there, I'm meeting with the FBI. I want to know what's going on in Ohio. And keeping in the back of my head the idea that the perpetrator of the vehicular homicide that took place at Charlottesville is from Northwest Ohio. It's from outside of Toledo. So my background was such that I was very well versed in domestic terrorism threats. I was a member of the office's National Security Unit starting in 2006. My early work as an assistant U.S. attorney was focused on international terrorism threats, but by about 2010, that had really split and diverged into two different tracks. We basically had international terrorism cases that we were investigating and prosecuting, and a whole host of domestic terrorism-related threats that came in a whole variety of different shapes and sizes, but prominent among them that I observed at the time were white supremacist neo-Nazi threats. It was very obvious and very clear to me at the time that this was a threat. So I stepped away from DOJ to go into private practice. When I came back as U.S. Attorney, my first day, as I said, my inclination was to meet with the FBI and talk about the neo-Nazi white supremacist threat. And I'll tell you, I was surprised because when it came to investigations focused on white supremacists or neo-Nazis, I was told that the cupboard was essentially bare in northern Ohio, which shocked me. And it's no fault of the FBI. I don't want to cast aspersions on that agency. I hold it in very high regard. They were dealing with a lot at the time. You saw the downtick in ISIS cases starting around that point in time. A lot of international terrorism threats had been mitigated, and so I think they were in a transitionary period between focusing on international terrorism and focusing on domestic terrorism. But I made it very clear that this had to be a priority for us, because I didn't want another perpetrator of a mass casualty attack in a white supremacist context to come from our district. I wanted to try to prevent that. And so we worked very closely through our National Security Unit, but also with all of the agencies that were represented in the Northern District of Ohio with some sort of authority to enforce these types of laws. And really we're focused on trying to prevent these attacks from happening ahead of time. And I think, through undercover operations, through tips from the public, through proactive law enforcement, local law enforcement, I think we did a pretty good job of that in my tenure as U.S. Attorney.
So on the point about confronting these issues ahead of time, the Harvard Law Bulletin noted last year that as a United States Attorney, you learned, and I'm quoting here, that obtaining convictions after terrorist acts occur is easy, given the gravity of the offenses, but they amount to too little, too late. You went on to say, you've already lost at that point. The harder task is to identify and stave off threats before they manifest. Now, in keeping with that approach and with the idea that you just mentioned, you have openly addressed all white supremacists in announcing charges against a white nationalist who had made threats to a Jewish community center. And I guess the question would be, do you think that other law enforcement throughout the country is doing enough of that to try to stave off these attacks before they occur? And if not, why not? What should they be doing?
Yeah, I think today the law enforcement focus on white supremacist ideology and neo-Nazi ideology is much more advanced than it was even back in 2017. It's not necessarily perfect, and I'm sure that there are regional disparities in how this is being approached by law enforcement. But I think broadly across the board, I'm certain that there are law enforcement officials who are in the audience here today, which is a good thing. Across the board, we've just seen too much of it, and any competent law enforcement agency is going to look at that and say, okay, do we have a threat in our community? How are we going about addressing it? And I think most importantly, and the whole reason behind the case that Tim's referring to was an online threat that was posted against the Jewish Community Center in Youngstown by a white supremacist who, by the way, was also present and photographed in Charlottesville holding a torch, a guy named James Reardon. He filmed himself with a Nazi-era submachine gun that you guys have all seen in movies about World War II, with screams and explosions and the sounds of bullets and an image of the Jewish Community Center of Youngstown in the background, and posted this. And the whole reason that we found out about this was a police officer from a small Ohio Township Police Department was responding to a domestic violence incident. Somebody down the street walked up to this officer, showed the video to the officer and said, hey, this is disturbing, this guy just posted this. Do you think that you should do something about this? And the officer said, absolutely. Called the FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force, and within 36 hours, we were swearing out search warrants and moving to arrest this guy. Because the threat was so profound, we could not take a chance of leaving this guy on the street and seeing whether or not he was going to actuate these threats that he'd put online.
So the idea then is to make sure that the word is out, that law enforcement is focused, is looking, and is going to be going after all of the folks who are out there posting, doing everything.
I think so. I mean, look, the bottom line is, if you have a conversation what I would tell local law enforcement, and I still do this today, is if you're interacting with somebody who's concerned about something, who perceives that there's a threat, at a minimum, just do something with the information. Call back to the station, talk to your chief, maybe call a prosecutor, just get some sense of whether or not this is a viable, prosecutable threat, or whether or not it's something else. But at a minimum, there should be some record of this particular incident. We know that there's a spectrum of activity, and there's spectrum that's, on the spectrum there's activity that's over here that's very close to First Amendment protected activity, and then on the spectrum there's the completed mass casualty terrorist attack. And you want to be somewhere to the left of that completed mass casualty terrorist attack. You want to do it legally, you want to do it within the bounds of the Constitution, but law enforcement has to be in a position to move forward on a case if they have a chargeable case under those circumstances. It's the only way that we're one up on the people who would commit these attacks.
Thank you. Jim, you had mentioned when we first met that it really took a combination of civil, criminal, and other social justice efforts and activism to break the Ku Klux Klan as we knew it. And we know that some of those lawsuits resulted in some huge verdicts that helped to accomplish that. And yet, we are experiencing a distinct rise in domestic terrorism and white supremacist violence and so forth, hate crimes. Can you talk about what the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice does and is doing to address all of that, please?
Sure, thank you, Tim. As far as what the criminal section does, we're probably a little bit different from most prosecutors, and certainly most prosecutors at Main Justice. We're like traveling prosecutors. And so when an incident happens, we are there. And we're working shoulder to shoulder with our U.S. Attorney colleagues and our FBI colleagues to not only investigate and then, where appropriate, prosecute these cases. As you alluded to, this problem is, and its solution is really bigger than a criminal response. It really requires a collaboration of civil work, criminal work, societal justice work. And even from a broader perspective, a different level, it requires us as a nation to come together and not tolerate these types of crimes. If you think about what hate groups and those individuals who espouse these ideologies are trying to do, they're inherently divisive. They try to establish an us versus them mentality. And to confront that, it really requires us as a nation to come together to say we're not going to tolerate that. And the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division tries to address this on a couple different levels. We obviously enforced the federal hate crime statutes, and so we tried to prevent, deter, hold perpetrators accountable, and importantly, vindicate the rights of victims. And in doing so, we build bridges between various groups and communities and law enforcement. And as Justin was kind of alluding to, it really requires that type of collaborative effort to get at the root of these crimes and to really address them. Look, everyone knows about the Tree of Life prosecution. Everyone knows about the prosecution in El Paso, Texas. But the criminal section is involved with numerous other cases across the country that may not have the national or international notoriety, but are incredibly important in the jurisdictions where they occurred. For example, we convicted a man who brutally attacked 3 men in Utah because he perceived them to be Mexican. A man in Missouri who horrifically shot and attempted to kill another man in Missouri because of sexual orientation. People who burned churches in Louisiana, Tennessee, a synagogue in Austin, Texas, and a mosque in Missouri. All of those cases are incredibly important to the communities which are impacted in those jurisdictions. And in doing those cases, we attempt to build trust and message that these communities, which sometimes are marginalized and shunted off into the shadows, they are important, they are respected, and they'll be protected. And so they are much more willing to build bridges and work with law enforcement. And so on a second level, ideally you build that trust. You establish those connections before an incident happens. And one of the things that we do is we work with our colleagues in the U.S. Attorney's offices, the FBI, and local and state law and tribal law enforcement to conduct outreach, to conduct trainings with various community groups and stakeholders in the community. So we're building those bridges, we're building those lines of communication to not only report and let us know about certain things, so hopefully we can prevent it before it happens, but also really to deter and try to bring people into the fold, so to speak, who may be predisposed to do some of these horrific acts.
Now, we know that you may be limited in what you are able to talk about in terms of pending matters or investigations that are active or matters that are on appeal. But with that having been said, can you share any insights into the Tree of Life prosecution that you partnered with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Pittsburgh in pursuing?
Sometimes the insights in these cases are varied. Sometimes they're depressing in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things that we've seen from the Tree of Life case and from some of the other cases, whether it's El Paso or some other mass shootings, as it pertains to hate crimes, the landscape is changing a little bit. Back 60, 100 years ago, everyone knows about the Klan, and you had kind of large hate groups that would be responsible for a lot of the terror and the violence. Through a work of some of the factors we just talked about, social activism, criminal prosecutions, and importantly, civil lawsuits, the Klan was broken in a lot of ways. I'm not saying it's completely gone. But what's happened in the following years is that the various number of hate groups, I wouldn't say is as large, but they proliferated. And these groups are not only more difficult to kind of detect, but you also have individuals that maybe aren't in a hierarchical structure, that don't answer to these groups, and sometimes float within groups from other. And sometimes they're called lone wolves, so to speak. And those individuals are very difficult to detect, and the methods that we have to use to try to get at that and prevent that have changed. These individuals, there was a reason why the Klan wore robes. You try to be in secret in that way, but they kind of had their own reinforcing community. Now, in the digital age, you have people on the internet, and sometimes that is their own world, and they don't have a check as far as, hey, this isn't right. That's kind of outside the norm. You have their own echo chamber, reinforcements, and they're hearing the same things over and over again, and they become more and more radicalized. And getting at that type of radicalization and criminal conduct while still respecting the First Amendment is an exceptionally difficult challenge. And so turning back to the Tree of Life, you had an individual who didn't have an extensive criminal record, who is radicalized and primarily acting on his own, and that's a difficult and scary situation.
Thank you. And now turning to Licha, Human Rights First has truly become one of the most important human rights organizations in the world. Its legal advocacy is vast, it is potent, it's effective in pursuing civil rights lawsuits and in holding violent extremists accountable. Can you talk about the recent case in Boston in which you partnered with a private law firm, the Foley Hoag firm, to sue a white nationalist group called the Patriot Front that had attacked a black musician named Charles Murrell? I think that, ironically, that attack, it's such a sad irony, actually had something to do with the Freedom Trail in Boston, too, of all things. I mean, but would you please share with us?
Yes, and it wasn't an accident that the attack happened along the Freedom Trail. I think Patriot Front planned it that way. It also happened over Independence Day weekend, so that adds an additional layer of irony and sadness to the story. But last month, Human Rights First, in partnership with Foley Hoag, a well-known Boston-based law firm who are representing the plaintiff pro bono, we partnered with Foley to file this lawsuit on behalf of plaintiff Charles Murrell. Tim, as you mentioned, Charles was attacked by this mob of Patriot Front members. It was around 100 members of Patriot Front who were marching down the street. They had descended on Boston to do a march, which is their modus operandi. They pick cities around the country, they congregate online and discuss online, and then they converge on a city and they march through the streets wearing their preppy clothes. So it's a new version of the Klan, if you will. There's not white, they don't wear white robes or white sheets anymore. Instead, they look like prepsters and wear net gaiters to conceal half of their face. But they march down the street espousing on the surface what appears to be patriotic values. I mean, they co-opted the word patriot in the name of the organization, and they march down the street with snare drums, kind of like a throwback to colonial era. But really, the veneer is so thin it's not even really a veneer. They're espousing hate, and their principles are that immigrants are not welcome in this country. Black and brown people are not welcome in this country. The true inheritors of America and the American dream are descendants of white Europeans. And so that is their message, and that is the message that they all are rallying around. And so in this situation, on July 2nd last year, Independence Day weekend, our plaintiff had just gotten out of the subway. He was walking to Copley Square to play saxophone for the public, which is something he really enjoys doing. He's a musician. He'd never heard of Patriot Front before, had no idea there was a march happening, and got out of the subway, and these Patriot Front members converged around him. They beat him up with their shields. They marched down the streets carrying these homemade shields, and they basically picked him out from the crowd. He was an innocent bystander just on his way to do really a public service, walking along the Freedom Trail. For those of you from Boston or know Boston, the Freedom Trail, it's not exactly a paved trail, but it's an area of landmark buildings and monuments that harken back to the Revolutionary War and independence from British colonizers. And so as a tourist, you can go walk along areas of the trail and see these landmarks. It's a very famous trail in Boston, and so Patriot Front was marching along these historic landmarks, the Freedom Trail, and attacked our plaintiff. Pushed him to the ground, beat him with the shields, pushed him against a light pole. He was bloodied, and he was taken to the hospital immediately thereafter and suffered physical injuries as well as some real emotional injuries from that experience, all of which he's still dealing with today. So in collaboration with Foley, this lawsuit was just filed on behalf of our plaintiff last month. We have 6 causes of action, state claims, but the lead cause of action is the federal KKK Act. It's a federal act where a private citizen can sue another private citizen for conspiracy to violate constitutional rights. And this act, it's called the KKK Act for a reason. It was enacted shortly after the Civil War. It was Congress's response to what was happening in the South, where, to no surprise, many white Southerners were not happy at all that they had lost the war and were enacting measures, both formal through the law and also informally, to deny the freedmen basic civil rights, the right to walk on the street, the right to go grocery shopping. And there was no cause of action at the time that an African American had under federal law to sue 2 or more people who are conspiring to deprive that person of their constitutional rights. So this act enacted by Congress shortly after the Civil War was in response to that, to allow a private cause of action. So this is the act that, a very, very old act, 150 years old approximately, and it's been revived, unfortunately, in recent years by a number of civil cases that have been brought against these newfangled neo-Nazi groups in an effort to dismantle and disrupt these neo-Nazi groups and to really bring attention to this growing movement of extremism where people are usually young, disaffected men. It can be women too, but in general, young, disaffected men, where they're congregating online, being radicalized online in their echo chamber, as Jim has mentioned, without having normal checks and balances of other real people to point out, hey, that this is actually extreme behavior, and it's just manifesting itself. And so you're seeing an increase of these civil cases under the KKK Act. Our case was modeled off of the Charlottesville case that was brought by those plaintiffs down there who were injured by Vanguard America, a neo-Nazi group that had descended on Charlottesville, where one of their allies had killed a woman and grievously injured many, many others. And that case was brought under the KKK Act, and so we modeled our case off of the Charlottesville case as a good model, and there are quite a few other cases that are percolating around the country, civil cases, using the Charlottesville case as the same model.
Now, one of the reasons that I think this is so important is because it represents a perfect example of the advantages to the private bar, because here we have a private law firm in Boston, partnering with a 501c3 nonprofit in pursuing civil litigation, and in this case, civil rights litigation. Can you talk a bit about the advantages to the private bar in partnering with the 501c3 and focus? I mean, what are some of the advantages in that the sharing of information and other aspects to that partnership?
Absolutely. It's been so far incredibly advantageous in the lawsuit that I just described, the federal suit out of Boston, for my nonprofit to partner with a private firm. First and foremost, the private law firms, they have tremendous brain power and tremendous resources that they can offer. And I think lawyers, they want to give back. They want to do pro bono. They just don't know the outlets. They don't know where to find plaintiffs. They have to balance it with their paying clients, of course, but you have a real need in law firms and a real desire to partner with a nonprofit and to donate their pro bono services. So the resources that law firms can provide are tremendous. You have the partners, you have the associates. It gives the associates obviously a lot of experience in litigating a case, and it really is, it's a higher calling to do these social justice cases. So it's a win-win. For the nonprofit, what we're offering, what nonprofits can offer is the human rights credentials, if you will, the street cred in that area. A lot of nonprofits go back decades and really have the institutional knowledge about what this movement is, where it started, who the players are, how it grows, so that you're attacking the movement, not just a singular defendant. You can sue a singular defendant, but it's better to design the case, if you can, so that you can address the roots of the movement, so that you're disrupting the extremism movement itself. And so nonprofits, that's one of the things that we can offer. We have that institutional knowledge. Human Rights First, we have an extremism policy team of leading experts on domestic violent extremism who have connections through various coalitions with other nonprofits, who have the deep knowledge, who have worked in this space for years, who have come from government. We have folks who came from government and who have connections in government to really be able to make this case larger than that of one plaintiff and a singular defendant or a singular neo-Nazi group. The point is to make as large of an impact as you can so that the movement is addressed rather than addressing one assault that happened on the street on a particular day. The other thing that we've been able to do at Human Rights First and many other nonprofits are doing as well is we're also partnering with investigative firms. So it's not just law firms who are donating their service. We have an investigative firm that is also donating their services pro bono as well. And so you need that in order to do the financial workup. Where are the assets of these extremists? Yeah, maybe they, live in a flop house or live at home in the basement, but are there bank accounts anywhere? Are there assets anywhere? Where's the financial network? Because you want to be able to disrupt that as well. And so investigative firms also are part of the partnership, and we encourage investigative firms to lend their resources as well. Tim, I really find that people want to help. They want to donate their services, they just don't know how. And so if you just go to a nonprofit, if you're a lawyer, an investigator out there, just go to a nonprofit who's doing social justice issues and just say, I'm here, let me tell you who I am. When you have any case where you think I can help, just call me. And I have a running list. I've got a running list of law firms, of lawyers, solo practitioners, big law, investigative firms, and as cases come up, I give them a call. So the partnership, it really works well.
Well, if anyone understands the importance of that partnership, it is the gentleman to your far left, Dan Cramer. Dan, you have had a long and distinguished career at Paul Weiss as a private attorney, and that career has included a commitment to pro bono work that's been very important. But your involvement with us here today and the intensity of your focus on these issues over the past few years has evolved for deeply personal reasons. And I wonder if you might share with our audience today those reasons and some of the work that has resulted.
Sure. Thank you, Judge. And let me just thank Laura Ellsworth and the people who put this conference together for the great work they do and for bringing us together. It's just been terrific to have this ability to meet all these wonderful people and to collaborate and have further collaboration. So thank you. So yes, my involvement in bringing litigation against white supremacists arises out of the Tree of Life shooting. One of the 11 victims of that event was my brother-in-law, Jerry Rabinowitz, the husband of my younger sister. And so after that terrible event, one of the things the people around me, the people in my family started thinking about was, what could we do? What positive thing can we do? How can we bring the privilege that we've had up to now and the skills that we've attained and focus it on trying to address this terrible problem of hate and the issue of white supremacists. My wife and my daughter both refocused their efforts to work with groups who are victims or survivors of gun violence. Given what I do for a living and given the law firm I'm involved in, my focus turned towards litigation, which comes very late in the game and is a small part of the response, but an important part of the response. And the more I looked at it, the more I saw that not only was violence by hate groups and people sucked into the white supremacist movement on the rise, but it coincided with a time when it was becoming mainstream. I think everyone here probably remembers the presidential debates last time when President Trump was asked to denounce white supremacists. And after trying to evade the question a little bit, he was posed with the question of what he would say to the Proud Boys. And you all probably remember what he said was, Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. And that led to an enormous amount of interest in the Proud Boys by a lot of people who were looking to join a group with those sorts of views, and made many of us worried that there was going to be a government-supported or tolerated group of thugs on the street trying to support some of these terrible, terrible white supremacist views. So I am fortunate to be at a law firm, Paul Weiss, that has a very long history of taking cases in the public interest, They represented the Scottsboro Boys before the Supreme Court. They represented Thurgood Marshall in Brown versus Board of Education. They recently represented the claimant that overturned the Defense of Marriage Act in the Supreme Court. So it's a firm that has a real commitment to devoting a lot of time and effort and resources on issues in the public interest. And I spoke to several people at the firm and I said, you know, we have large law firms devote hundreds of thousands of hours each year to doing good pro bono work, but they're not focused on the issue of white supremacists. They're not really focused on this problem. Lawyers in my firm were co-lead counsel in the Charlottesville case, so that was good. And I wanted to develop in my law firm a whole group of lawyers that were devoted to fighting these cases and just sort of getting a whole group together. And we've been successful in that over the last few years. I know Licha spoke about the importance of teaming up with civil rights groups like Human Rights First, Southern Poverty Law Center, ADL, States United, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. There are a lot of fantastic groups out there, and we have joined forces with them. They are an incredible source of knowledge about these cases. They usually are the ones with boots on the ground that connect us up with the victims, because you have to have a plaintiff to bring these cases. And they're just wonderful partners to work with. And in one of our cases, and this I'd be interested in, Justin and Jim, we're more and more interested in seeing how we can work with or help support government efforts in this area. And so we brought a lawsuit. We were hired by the Attorney General of the District of Columbia to bring a lawsuit on the AG's behalf, seeking to get damages for harm inflicted on the Metropolitan Police officers who defended the Capitol on January 6th and suffered tremendous physical and psychological harm. So I think there's so much to do here. There's so much work that can be done here. And I know there are a lot of law firms with enormous talent, and I'm just hoping that we can make this a bigger and bigger part of law firm pro bono work and work with government and work with civil rights groups and bring more of these cases.
Well, I could, obviously, I know we all could go on and discuss at length some of the other cases and issues that you have all worked on and have been involved with that are not only relevant to the work that we are all doing here, but resonate and really open doors of opportunity for so many throughout the country and throughout the world. But we are out of time. I would simply note that your brother-in-law's heart continues to beat through the work that we do at this conference, and I am not the one who really initially made that observation. A gentleman yesterday made the observation that the hearts of all the victims continue to beat through the work that we do at this conference, and that is most certainly true in the work that you do in court and at your firms and at your organizations to try to address and to redress the scourge of hatred and violence and the delusion of supremacy and all the things that bring us here today that we are so focused on. So Thank you all very much, and would you join me, please, in thanking this distinguished panel?